there's more water content in a fish in seafood than there is in beef, for example. And the way fish are harvested and the way the energy of that environment is sort of transmuted in the fish is also something that I think is worth acknowledging. Fish that are harvested in a humane way and then handled in a respectful way are going to have a different energy in those water crystals than a fish that, suffocated on a long line or had a very difficult, wild capture sort of experience. And in a practical sense, the Japanese, again, have been able to quantify that in shelf life.
Hi, welcome to Integration, where we explore the art of moving forward, not just sustaining, but transforming. The great ones among us don't see setbacks, only the landscape of possibility before them. My guests have learned to navigate what is, which is what inspires me, to find ways to keep going and leave the world better than they found it. When the storm comes, they don't just endure, they lean into it. I hope you enjoy my guest today. Hello and welcome everybody back to Integration. Today, I have a wonderful guest sitting in Hawaii. His name is James Arthur Smith, and he has done the remarkable work of heading into the the farmed fish space and really making it an ethical product. And I've listened to him a couple of times now, and I find it a really fascinating journey. But rather than me talking it out, I'm going to let James introduce and tell a bit about his story, because he's really made some inroads in this space. And with seafood now at something like 50% of global protein, and it's done that in a massively short time, I think this is a really big subject that we should be spending more time on. And with that, welcome, James. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Samantha. I appreciate you creating this space and asking these questions. You poised it as though I have done something amazing to make aquaculture more holistic. And the truth is, aquaculture started out in a really beautiful way. As, for example, here in Hawaii, we had Hawaiian fish ponds. And the practice, if you applied modern terminology, would be called extensive aquaculture. So it's low density farming and exposure to natural environments and natural feeds that are species appropriate. What happened in the last 30 years, and really aquaculture has only commercialized since the 1970s, is that big industry, oftentimes the exact same money that's involved in the largest feedlot factory, cattle and chicken farms, applied those same investment capital dollars, business models to how do you maximize the financial outcomes of an industry like salmon farming. And the methodologies strayed from species appropriate nutrient rich diets to low cost inputs and that maximize growth. And when you feed salmon or any species something that's not appropriate in their diet, like genetically modified corn and soy and rapeseed oil, it doesn't have the same outcomes. You don't have nutrient dense fish. But when you go back and say, hey, let's feed them the original source of nutrients, the microalgae that provides the omega-3s and species-appropriate proteins like insect proteins, you can create nutrient-dense, truly scalable food systems that are in symbiotic relation to the environment on the blue planet.
It's interesting you say that, because I went to Brazil at one point, into the deep part of the Amazon with a bunch of entrepreneurs. And because of my agricultural thing, I was kind of asking wherever I could. Of course, the people I with knew nothing. But I did start to get, the Monsanto Bayer people were deep in that area. And the level of chemical being sprayed was like, I asked this one guy, one of the biochemical people that I met there, and I said, well, how do you live with the fact that they're spraying so much? He said, well, is it our fault that they don't read the label and they do 20 times the level of what it says on the thing, on the label? And I'm like, I felt like saying, well, yes, it is your responsibility, because they can't read it and don't understand it, and they're just trying to get the same result that they got the first time they used it, and they don't understand that just putting more isn't going to make that happen. So I thought about it a lot, because I'm in a dry continent in Australia, and the runoff effect in a place like Brazil. And I just kept hearing from Guatemala all the way through the flooding and the amount of water runoff. So I kept thinking about all those chemicals going into the rivers. And that river, the Rio Negro, is extraordinary. It's so deep, it's so full. So I really kept thinking about the sea life. And then not just farmed, but wild, everything is getting that stuff in it. So I was really curious to see how you were going about eliminating what was in the water into the farmed fish stuff that you were getting. So I'd love to hear more about that, how you came about working that out.
Well, it's funny because I've been in this space for over a decade now, and for years, our motto was trying to celebrate the most sustainable farms using the most sustainable feeds, the most, truly sustainable species. For a while, we would sell that direct to farm-to-table restaurants that cared about those things. When we tried to sell direct to consumers, we had moderate success because, unfortunately, the reality is most consumers aren't yet willing to pay what it actually costs for better practices.
Same with organic.
Out of sight,
It's the
out of
same.
mind.
Absolutely.
But one space that we do see consumers really expressing interest in and voting with their dollars is when you can quantify something that's either cleaner or more nutrient rich or both.
You are getting that result. That's good because I wasn't seeing that when I was seeing people making that marketing differentiation unless it was in an organic space.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of interest now, and we're doing that through certificate of analysis lab testing on every lot that we raise. And it provides a really powerful signal both to farmers and to consumers. So consumer wants to vote for something that's certifiably cleaner, has lower levels of mercury, which is increasingly toxic in the environment, 300% higher today than it was beginning of industrial revolution. And
Wow.
mercury is one of the most toxic elements on the planet. It's, I think, second to plutonium. It's not something we should take lightly. Microplastics, increasingly an issue, forever chemicals, and as you mentioned, pesticides. When you actually test for a lot of these elements and you start to see it showing up in certain environments and not in others, you can quantifiably say, hey, I don't want to buy that anymore.
Yeah.
And as a
That's
consumer,
great.
you say, I definitely don't want it. And when we can, and oftentimes the farms aren't doing this level of testing, or at least they're not disclosing it. So when we start testing fish, that's one of the main differentiators of what we've been doing with Seatopia, is doing the most detailed testing of any seafood brand that I'm aware of. So we test not only for the toxic elements that are increasingly present in the oceans and rivers and freshwater systems, but also the nutrients. So fully quantifying the milligrams of omega-3, EPA, DHA, omega-6. So we're testing not only for toxicity, but also nutrients so that you can actually quantifiably say how many milligrams per serving of omega-6, omega-9 is in a product. And when you can identify the omega-3, omega-6, omega-9 ratio, you can provide, it's a telltale sign of what that animal was fed. So for example, if you're feeding fish a diet that's rich in omega-3s and low in omega-6s, it's going to be healthier for you and for the animal because omega-6s in you and me increases inflammation, same thing in the animals. And you can see that on a lab test. You can vote for it. So what feeds are going to result in a better balance? So things like microalgae as opposed to canola oil or rapeseed oil. When we simply change the feed, but we don't test it, customers don't even know. Why would a customer vote for something that's out of sight, out of mind? Why would a farm have a financial incentive other than maybe there's like a slight improvement in survival rates or greenwashed ideas? What happens when we start lab testing every lot and providing that data transparently is profoundly powerful signal bidirectionally both to consumers
and are you getting a pretty consistent result year in, year out now from your farms in those tests, or does it vary a lot seasonally?
No, it's pretty consistent. What's really happening, I think, more than anything, is some of the farms that we've been working with are realizing that we're holding them accountable. So for example, I'll give you a story. There's a farm that we were working with that has one of the most innovative and, let's say, sustainable practices of raising fish in the world. They're far offshore in a deep current environment, 5 miles offshore. Imagine trying to operate a business 5 miles offshore in the open ocean. Very technically challenging. The mooring systems, the cages are completely submersible. So during storms, they can go down deep, I think like 4 to 8 meters deep. And then they bring them back up for servicing and maintenance and harvest. They have monitoring systems that automatically feed all these things. And they had a feed that was circular economy ideals of a local byproduct. So from
Wow.
an MSC certified local fishery, they were using the byproduct to turn into a fish meal. That sounds great. Sounds sustainable. It's great. Everybody's giving it a thumbs up. When we lab tested it, we noticed that from one lot to the next, the levels of mercury went up. And when we asked deeper questions, they said, oh, we hadn't even thought to test the variance in the mercury levels when we changed an element in the feed. But when they went from anchovetas to this byproduct of a local MSC certified tuna fishery, because tuna are much higher on the trophic level, they have, frankly, more exposure and years of bioaccumulation, biomagnification of mercury that's naturally occurring in the ocean. And that
Mm-mm.
bioaccumulation is still in that byproduct that was being fed to those fish for a year and a half until they were harvested. We had to stop buying that because that level of mercury, frankly, for me to eat it once a week is not a big deal, but it wouldn't be within the guidelines for a pregnant mother to eat. And
Yeah,
so we
depends
can't,
on your situation.
so and that's sort of the Seatopia standard. That's the Seatopia promise is that if it's not safe enough for a pregnant mother, we're not going to put it in the Seatopia catalog. So the Seatopia standard is this is the cleanest, safest products available. And
And
that
your story was that you came from that point of your wife being pregnant. It's a personal story, isn't it?
it absolutely is. When I switched the entire Seatopia standard to what my wife wasn't willing to put in her body, it leveled up our sort of integrity, our North Star in a way that said zero detectable microplastics, less than 0.1 parts per million of mercury, quantifiably higher levels of omega-3 EPA and DHA in balance to omega-6s and 9s. And if it doesn't have that, then it probably isn't the right thing for an unborn child
And so do
or
you get
for
a
a
lot
new
more
baby.
pregnant women then? Do you get a lot more pregnant women as a result of that? Is that in your marketing to let that be known? Because I know that most women become really interested when they're pregnant. I mean, because they're suddenly
Absolutely.
creating life. So I would think
Absolutely.
that'd
But
be a big
also,
part of it.
absolutely. We have a lot more pregnant women as customers because of this, but also biohackers and people who are really focused on longevity, who are optimizing nutrition and lifestyle in every element that they're putting into their body, exposing themselves
That
to
makes
in a
sense.
way that says, how do I reduce exposure to toxins and optimize my nutrition in the most bioavailable form?
Is that a very growing market? I don't know much about the biohacking market. Is it expanding with
Absolutely.
aging public?
I think it's absolutely growing. It's sort of like a pendulum swing from the industrialization of the food systems in America. And frankly, we saw a decline in the average American lifespan and still is plateaued. And that has been, according to the Mayo Clinic, attributed to the sort of industrialization of the food system and the quality of nutrition. So for a growing population of people who actually care to live longer and be healthier and have lower incidence of disease, the biohacking sort of movement is giving them the sort of tools and empowerment to make decisions that are going to allow us to be healthier. I mean, as a population in the United States, unfortunately, we have one of the highest healthcare expenses and also some of the worst cases of disease
Health. Yeah.
and health and even uh, for first world countries, the average lifespan has been going down. We're not by any means like considered one of the healthiest countries, and that has mostly been attributed to food systems. Biohacking, I think, is sort of a response to that. It's like, how do we
Big
take
market.
control again of our life and our health to not, have issues of, deteriorating mental
And
acuity and
Is the cost much different? Like for the person that isn't biohacking, it just wants to eat well. Is it a big difference in finance to buy your fish to normal fish?
I wouldn't say it's big, but it's definitely not price parity at the moment because a lot of commodity farm fish is being raised on subsidized commodities, and it's really hard to compete, if you're
Yeah, with
feeding a
free food.
fish, yeah, cornflakes as opposed to microalgae. But
Yeah.
economies of scale will flip that, and hopefully eventually we'll see some more price parity with the reduction of some subsidies for GMO crops and things if that changes. In the interim, Utopia is a market-based solution to bring more dollars to a handful of farms who have really made that commitment. Like you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, 50% or more of seafood today comes from farms. Well, a fraction of that meets the Seatopia standard.
Yeah, I
It's
bet.
it's kind of like in cattle or beef, you have
Premium.
huge percentage of the market is factory farmed on corn and soy, and a smaller percentage is grass fed, and a smaller percentage is grass finished and pasture raised and regenerative. We're seeing the same sort of thing with aquaculture, where finally there is optionality, and consumers are applying that same type of thinking. Like, what was it fed? How was it raised? And what is the nutritional value of this?
Now, I want to ask you a question because I am very interested in this stuff. And I looked on your website and I wrote to your customer service and I said, well, where can I buy your salmon in Australia? Because I'd like to buy some. And they said, oh, well, you'll need to go on the King Aura site. That's our supplier. So I went on the King Aura site in New Zealand, and I happened to have been ringing all the New Zealand salmon people because I had bought salmon locally and they'd said it was organic. And then I rang the company and I rang several fish farms in New Zealand, and they all said there's no such thing as organic salmon here. So I
No, there's no
went
such thing.
and
Only
so
in
I
Europe.
went, and then I went to King Aura, and I couldn't see anything about their food because their very long video, which is extensively and beautifully prepared, when it gets to the two most critical things, how do they wash and clean their pens and what do they feed their fish? It doesn't say anything. It says they wash their pens by spraying them. Okay, well, what do they do with all that muck that comes off it? So it looks like it's going back into the ocean. And what are they doing with the fish? They just showed you a handful of pellets and didn't tell you anything about what was in them. So I was left really knowing no more than I did before, other than they've got a very good marketing team making a beautiful video. But if you know what you're looking
I
for,
can
it doesn't
point
really
you.
say anything.
Yeah. Thank you for that feedback. The reality of the situation with our customer service is not as detailed and as it could be. There are a handful of farms in New Zealand raising king salmon, and not all of them are using the same practices. The largest ones are potentially the more mainstream, and Ora King falls into that category. There are farms that we are working with, like Mount Cook, like
So
Akora.
you don't use King Aura then?
We do. We work with a handful of farms in New Zealand, not just Ora King salmon. So Ora King
Aura King,
salmon is
sorry.
one of, I think, five king salmon varietals that are being raised in New Zealand. And so the business model of Seatopia is not to say we won't work with somebody that isn't a perfect example today. Our business model is to help change the industry. So if we work with a partner, there's a commitment to uh, evolving their farming practices and feeds over time transparently. And that's the only way to affect change, right? So it's kind
Yep.
of like, how do we from the inside say, we're coming to you with money to buy your product and tell your story honestly and transparently with integrity? Exchange, we want you to make commitments to every year be transparent and move towards this goal. And we're going to help you because our customer is willing to pay for it. So, for
Well, I'm a
example,
customer that's willing to pay for it, and I wouldn't pay for it based on their advertising because it doesn't
yeah,
say
great.
what they're doing with their food. So I
Yeah.
just don't
Well,
eat salmon. My viewpoint is I know I've been looking at the salmon industry for a long time, and until I know what's going in the food, I'm not doing it.
yeah.
So
Well, I
that's why
can
I was
point you
really
to,
keen on you guys.
yeah, I can to specific farms in New Zealand and around the world that do have public facing, more transparency, and more innovative practices. I can point you to some that have completely removed the uses of corn and soy, completely removed the use of fish oil and fish meal, and are literally part of the most cutting edge projects to scale truly nutrient rich, species appropriate salmon, trout, and yellowtail. It's not impossible to raise fish without pillaging the ocean for fish oil and fish meal. And it's definitely not impossible to raise them without using canola oil and soy protein. It's a matter of getting the ship, and sometimes these organizations have long-term commitments to their feed partners. Sometimes they have long-term commitments to their farming practices, and sometimes they simply have really large hens or lots, and you can't just feed some of those fish a certain diet and some of them another diet. And if our buying power is not sufficient to buy an entire lot, how do I convince them to change their entire feed model? I can convince them to maybe change one ingredient and next year another one. But until I can buy an entire lot, they're not going to change everything.
So tell me, how do you do that then? If you're selling a product with, it's got to be safe for a pregnant woman, but you know it isn't safe because it's got X, Y, and Z still. What do you do? Sell it as your seconds? Or, how do you do that then?
No, it still meets our criteria. It has certain things in there that I don't think are absolutely scalable. So if you're still using fish oil and fish meal, is that scalable? I don't think it's a scalable solution. It's still a finite resource. We should not build a food system that continues to rely on a finite resource, which is bait fish, swordfish. I'm going to take that product and I'm going to send it to the laboratory every time I receive it, and I'm going to quantify what the levels of mercury and microplastics are, just like that farm that I was telling you about earlier. They were using those feeds, but they were also using a 1% inclusion or replacement of microalgae and committed to increasing that every year.
Oh, I see. That's great. It's wonderful you've got such a growing model, something to help them grow. That's a wonderful concept.
We move the needle for a small farm. With an artisan farm, we can come in there and buy an entire lot, and they love us for it because there's not one marine biologist that got into aquaculture that said, I want to build commodity aquaculture farms. No. The problem is when they go to sell it, if the local grocery store is not willing to pay a premium for higher levels of omega-3s and understands the difference between omega-6s and 9s, and if they're not willing to pay for fish that has a insect protein diet as opposed to a fish meal diet or a soy protein diet, then they're not going to be able to financially do it. So we have to build channels for them to move through this, what we call the Seatopia standard, sort of 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. And hopefully this has the ability to change an entire industry. But we're currently working with small farms that are stoked that we exist. And we're working with big farms who think we're this annoying buyer who is constantly asking them for new things, right? But
you're the mosquito.
We're kind of annoying to some of these larger farms. But as our snowball grows, and as more consumers start asking, if you go to your local market and say, what salmon is raised on a microalgae diet? What salmon is raised on an insect protein diet? Are any of these fish-free feeds? And which ones have quantifiably the highest levels of omega-3s? Which ones don't have microplastics? Which ones don't have, what are the mercury levels? If those were on the nutrition facts panels, it would change the entire industry.
And to be fair, to change the entire industry, you couldn't do it overnight. It needs to happen gradually. So in a way, what you're doing is the right way because you're making something that will grow in itself organically. And then maybe you can introduce things onto the packets a little bit more and make that and hopefully conversations like this get out into the public to make them aware of why that stuff's relevant. I thought it was interesting because I have been doing some research around omega-3. There's a guy that I interviewed called Pierre Wiel. Have you heard of him? It's called Blue White Heart in French, Bleu Blanc Coeur in France. And he did a government study with 40, it was peer reviewed, all the rest of it. And they proved that any meat, and you understand when you take omega oil and you cook it, you denature it anyway. So I had always said it's not really the omega oil, it's what the omega oil references of the entire body of nutrients that are in balance. So what they proved that was within 2 weeks to 4 weeks, the entire omega balance in the humans eating the food from meats that had been grown on omega-rich diets completely rebalanced in the humans, and the study group hadn't changed at all. They were eating the same diets. One was from a regenerative farm with lots of flaxseed and stuff that the meat was being fed, and the other was not. So it was a very scientific standard. And I have always maintained that whilst we talk about omega oils, the omega oil it's an indicator. It's like why I talk about carbon in the soil. It's an indicator. You can get just as much omega-3 oil in a land-based animal, but it's about its diet, its native diet, or the diet that feeds it well. So that's why I'm so interested in your focusing on the diet part of the fish and what they're being fed that is native to the animal for it to produce omega-3, because it's a great thing to measure. Does that make sense?
I think so. I'm going to try to provide what
Suffer.
I understand about this.
Yep.
We don't produce omega-3s, neither do fish. My understanding is that we can convert some things like omega-6s and 9s into omega-3s, but we don't produce them. That's why they're essential that we consume them from our diet, through the diet. And the body's ability to convert like an omega-6 to omega-9 is real, but it's not nearly as efficient as eating omega-3s. And there's a big difference between, a lot of people just talk about omega-3s, even though like specifically omega-3s and 9s and 6s are very, very different. Fish don't produce omega-3s either, right? Like all omega-3s get into fish through microalgae that were then consumed by something else, either directly by that fish or bioaccumulated. And it's beautiful to think about the actual origin of life on this planet, all going back to the ocean, the very first, single cell organisms. That's why DHA in particular, like DHA and EPA are associated with longevity, with heart health, with relaxation, with being able to, have a higher IQ. Like there's a specific correlation between increasing the levels of DHA and EPA in an unborn child and their IQ. And it's like significant increase. And then also continuing to give it to them as a young child quantifiably increases their IQ even more. Quantifiably, we live longer. There's a lot of studies that look at all the different nutrients and said that omega-3s were probably the single thing that resulted in most improvements to health. And it all is, if you look at it through like an evolutionary biology perspective, it makes perfect sense because we've all evolved from the ocean. This perception for a lot of people that live on Earth that this is all land and all Earth, is just dirt, and that our ancestors came out of the trees and went and started hunting wildebeest and buffalo. And that's how we got our omega-3s and evolved our prefrontal cortex. Possibly more likely is that there was a rich source of protein that didn't fight back in the rivers and the estuaries and the oceans and the shorelines. And if you just went and collected shellfish and in a little community of early man, were collecting oysters and mussels and cracking them open and communicating with each other and collaborating, all of a sudden you had a rich source of proteins and omega-3s, and that access to DHA was a key inflection point in the evolutionary development of our prefrontal cortex. And it's interesting, our eyeballs are pure DHA, and our spinal cord, it's not just allowing a fish to be able to move in cold water. It's about electrical transmissions. Our brain functions on DHA. It's very important that the foods that we eat, foods that are rich in EPA and DHA, and while plant-based sources can have higher than certain plants have higher levels of omega-3 than others, it's often the omega-6s or maybe just EPA. It's not DHA. DHA is a real significant unlock that primarily comes from marine-based microalgae.
No, I think it's wonderful. I suppose the reason I say the cold thing is because it's about like trying to make it really simple, the concept that like when we talk about omega-3, 6 and 9, I like to say, well, think of omega-3 as the fat that doesn't go hard in the ocean so the fish can swim, or think of omega-9 as like a candle wax and it goes rigid and it takes a long time to melt it. I'd just like to make it a real simple way of communicating those different fats, so that because people work with cooking and something that's real to them. So butter is a 6, candle is a 9, and the fat in a fish is like a 3. So that was just sort of why I said that. It was because you think, why does a fish in freezing cold water able to keep moving? It's because that fat in it, which keeps it warm, also doesn't go hard. So it's just that sort of visual of it was mainly the reason I said it. Wasn't that I didn't think it didn't do other things. So you went into the science of it, which is great. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, I like to get pretty nerdy on these things. Yeah, it's a really interesting history when you start to dive deep into why so much of life on this planet depends on omega-3s and how, like, we all just evolved from the ocean, right? We still have these connections that work better when we have that rich source of DHA in our systems. And it's not just humans, it's a lot of life on this planet.
Mm. No, it's really a fascinating topic. I started studying it back in 99 when I got pregnant, or 98, I think it was. So I do know that's why I thought the pregnancy thing was a really good trigger, because certainly that's what triggered me, was growing a life in my body and going, oh. So I figure it's a pretty big point for most women that maybe have not put a thought towards it for themselves. They're only interested in what they look like to attract the opposite sex. And then they grow a baby and they start going, oh, I've got this thing inside of me. What's going on? What have I got to feed to make it, thrive in the world? So that's why I thought it was a really good point that you're talking about that in Cohen's thing. I had a question I wanted to ask you about that. When you first got into it and you started to do it and you've run up against these, because the nature of my podcast is about resilience and hitting those hard walls, and how did you keep going? I'm sure that when you first got at it and you discovered this is what I want to do and I'm focusing on this point, and you've got the price point is, say, a problem. And I would say it's the education point too. Getting the education across the line to get the consumer to buy, and the cost of doing those tests, because I've looked a lot at the testing thing and it's so expensive. Even when people say it's affordable, it's so expensive. Thousands and thousands of dollars, and you're selling a piece of fish for what? Few dollars. Like it's just, there's so many sales you've got to make, and you've got so many metrics and health food standards and some things that people have no idea what it takes for you to. They think of things like, I took a fishing line out and I threw it in the ocean. It shouldn't be that much money. And you go, oh, there's a lot more going on here. So my question to you in that is, when you came up against the many problems I'm sure you came up against, rather than going into all the problems, what were the things that kept you going and enabled you to find the funds, raise the money, get to that next stage? And what were some of the sort of key points in your journey that you had to overcome?
It's so easy to talk about all the hardships. We could go down that rabbit hole, because it's not easy. It's like, to do something with integrity, like in the seafood space, has required us to rethink entire systems. We're not just selling seafood. Like, we are now trying to address consumer education, and we're trying to address distribution logistics, and we're trying to address stigmas of all sort of generalizations about farm fish and bring more like nuance and option to that story. We're addressing issues of then stigmas against frozen seafood, because frankly, fresh seafood distribution is not scalable or sustainable, because it's all reliant on either air freight and or styrofoam. And so we've opted to not do anything fresh and do everything frozen and optimize.
Most people in the environmental space with fresh meat have done that. Yeah, it's too hard. I know that. But fresh frozen seafood, because I will say one thing, my family run restaurants, and I actually tried to introduce organic fish from organic trout. There was one group making it here. This is maybe 15 years ago. And I tried to but they were way up north and they were doing inland trout, and it was all the food was organic. Everything was organic. They were doing it. But the food tasted terrible. By the time you brought down a piece of frozen trout from freshwater trout, I just thought it was watery and tasteless. And I thought, look, it could be the best thing for you in the world, but it tastes ordinary. It's awful. There's just too much water in the frozen good. So I wondered. I'm sure a lot of stuff's improved since that with Snap, all that sort of stuff because it's so many years ago now. But I'm curious. How did you
I think it
overcome some of
happened.
those? How did you overcome some of those problems with?
Yeah.
I'm sure they were
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, no, fortunately, freezing technology has evolved quite a lot. So, for example, thanks to our friends in Japan who get so beautifully nerdy on a lot of these things, the technology for freezing tuna, for example, has evolved quite a lot. If you freeze if you have a fish that could fetch $1 million and you need to move it from, you know, one part of the world to the other part of the world, you're not going to you have to make sure that it's properly frozen. And there's a huge difference between your home freezer and what is being done today with nitrogen freezing, blast freezers. Frankly, a lot of the fish that gets consumed today at sushi markets, sushi bars, was frozen and then defrosted. The nuance is how was it frozen and how was it defrosted? So just to give a little bit of technical understanding here, when you freeze something in your home freezer, it slowly freezes over the course of, let's say, a thick piece of fish might take 24 hours to freeze. And
Really, that
while it's
long?
freezing, it could be, yeah. And during that process, the relatively fragile connective tissue within fish gets pierced by the water content that's in that fish freezing and forming crystals. And those crystals then saturate, permeate, and make that fish soggy and absorb moisture. When you then defrost that fish, it's going to have a lot of water content in it and it's going to be mushy. Very, 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 very different if you take that same piece of fish and before you vacuum seal it, for example, you put it into a cold room with big fans on it that are blowing cold air over it, and they're actually pulling moisture away from it, wicking moisture, much like the
It's dry.
Vikings used to dry their fish up on the cliffs. So you're partially drying that fish, and then you put it into a even colder environment where it freezes, like with liquid nitrogen. And now
That's
you have
fascinating.
a fish that has less water content, frozen quickly. And so whatever water content that is in there, instead of forming intricate crystals like a snowflake, it has little tiny daggers. And then when you defrost it, you have less water content in it. You have less breakage of connective tissue. And when you defrost it, you don't just put it under warm water or cold water even. You defrost it slowly in a manner where you can wick moisture. So what we recommend people do is while it's still frozen, you wrap it in paper towels or tuna paper. You put it on a sheet tray in your refrigerator where air can go on both sides of it. And over 24 hours, as it's defrosting, whatever moisture is in there is wicking away. So once it's fully defrosted, it's actually a beautiful dry piece of protein, not a wet, slimy.
So you put it on paper towel, did you say? So it's being
Yeah,
wicked out that way directly. The fish is sitting directly on paper towel.
yeah, completely
Oh, that's
wrapped
fascinating.
and it's
Yeah, yeah.
actually going to, the goal is really to pull moisture away while protecting it from oxidation. And then when
That's really
it's
interesting.
completely defrosted, it's dry and it's not wet. It has,
That's so interesting. There's something I went to a conference in New York years ago about technology they were working out on keeping nutrients in fruit and vegetables picked in the field. And they were actually putting refrigerators in the field as they picked. But the refrigerator they found that the slower opposite of this, the slower the temperature that it was brought down, the more nutrient was held within it. So they'd been putting
interesting.
stuff in too cold, and they found by putting it in a slow temperature and taking it down, it didn't damage the nutrients. It must be to do with crystallization forming. I do glass work. I have a glass kiln, and I know that the tempering of glass is all about the formation of the crystals. And it's so critical, taking the temperature up and taking it down, how you build those crystals and how they're formed. And in glass, it's got to be really, really slow. So the crystals are very, very small. And so you get glass, for instance, that can handle temperatures like, heat glass. That's been done over days and days to get the temperature so that the crystals are so fine. It can handle incredible hot and cold shocks. And that's about the crystals forming. So it's really interesting to hear you say that about the fish, because it's kind of like a different nerdy thing about which way. And I often find that with things
Oh,
that are
it's similar
cold,
though too. It's
it's
actually similar
similar,
because if you were
but the
farming
opposite.
a warm water fish, and you go and put it directly into that environment, it's going to have a different effect than doing a cold water species. So uh, some of what you're saying actually makes sense. Generally, what warm water tropical species will do is they'll take it from the warm water environment. When it's harvested, they'll put it into a slush ice environment, and then it goes through rigor for 24 hours, and then it relaxes in a refrigerated room where it's going to get processed. So they're not going straight into the freezer. It has also
See?
like a similar thing of, yeah, 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 yeah. It's beautiful. And it comes down to crystals and water and the memory of water and the formation. Yeah.
There's so little that the consumer knows about this stuff until, I mean, they've got now books out on it and stuff, but not that many people are that nerdy that they go into all that technical stuff about cooking. You tend to learn the basics and throw it again. You don't have time to do all that stuff. But it is fascinating if you understand the principle behind something, how you can work within a principle and get that. So that's a great tip about taking a frozen fish and putting it on paper. I'd never thought about that.
Yeah.
I tend
And
to just put it
also
on the bench or.
and also while you're talking about fruit, it's interesting, there's a lot of water in fish, right? There's more water content in a fish in seafood than there is in beef, for example. And the way fish are harvested and the way the energy of that environment is sort of transmuted in the fish is also something that I think is worth acknowledging that, fish that are harvested in a humane way and then handled in a respectful way are going to have a different energy in those water crystals than a fish that, you know,
I love it.
suffocated on a long line or had a very difficult, wild capture sort of experience. And in a practical sense, the Japanese, again, have been able to quantify that in shelf life. So a fish that is humanely harvested with what we call ikejime practices, which is as quickly as possible, and as humanely as possible, killing the fish, harvesting the fish, reducing stress, removing lactic acid, has a longer shelf life than a fish that is simply like what a lot of fishermen do, is just like
Which is
throw
so
on the
critical
deck.
to seafood because it's
Yeah,
such a short shelf life on a fish. So that's
yeah,
so interesting.
yeah,
I mean, it is Emoto Misura that came out with the thoughts on water, so it makes sense the Japanese would come up with it.
yes,
That's fantastic.
yes,
I love that bit of knowledge. I'm going to use that one. That's going to go into my cooking without a doubt. That's
yes.
fabulous. So tell
Yeah.
me, what else were some of the areas that you had to overcome and how did you do it? What are the critical turning points for you?
The biggest one I think that you mentioned it was price, right? So to go back to like how I got into this journey, I really sought out one of the most innovative farms, doing the most innovative practices with the most innovative feeds. And I started working with this farm and helped bring to market one of the first Kampachi farms. And when we brought this product to market using innovative feeds and low density farming in beautiful, beautiful turquoise waters, the distributors simply weren't willing to pay for it. Like most farms simply sell to distributors and that's it. They just focus on farming. And that business model was not going to work if we just sold to distributors because they simply said, based on country of origin and species, this is what we pay. And other farms in the same country with the same feed,
Yeah.
or even in other countries with the same species, simply were not getting a price that was commensurate with the cost that went into raising this fish on better feed. So
Yeah.
we had to figure out how to exist as a business. And next thing you know, I was hauling fish from southern Baja, Mexico, 1,000 miles up the Baja Peninsula to the closest market that was willing to pay what it cost, where there was like high-end farm-to-table white tablecloth restaurants that had a business model that cared about where food came from, wanted to authentically tell the story of where their chicken and their beef came from and what they were fed, and was willing to come and visit the farms and vet that. So I was now driving fish into restaurants, carrying fish, knocking on the doors of chefs, introducing them, trying to figure out how to sell this fish outside of the traditional distribution channels. And then finally built a small enough distribution network within farm to table restaurants to tiny artisan operation, you know, uh, afloat. But it was still very, very challenging and
Niche.
highly fragmented distribution. And when one chef would change, and all of a sudden you had to start all over. And then you get into restaurant groups, and no longer is the chef making the decision on the buying. Now you had like a controller or a CFO who was going to overrule their decisions and, save $1 per pound and work with something else that, had a less story, but was cheaper. And then one night, everything turned off. All of the restaurants that we were selling to closed because of COVID. And that was a very scary time because, when you're
For a lot of people.
operating a business that requires feeding thousands and thousands of animals every single day with the expectation that, a year from now, you're going to be able to sell it to these restaurants. And what do? Do you stop feeding these animals? And we had to make a decision to harvest and freeze everything that we had and try to figure out a new market. And that's where Seatopia emerged, was let's figure out how to sell direct to consumer. Fortunately, the culture changed, and buying perishable goods online started to become more commonplace. And little by little, we were able to grow that. And it also happened that we were able to reach out to other farms that were in a similar situation and help them.
I bet they were so pleased you did.
Yeah,
Because they were
there
all
was no crystal
suffering.
ball. Everybody had was frozen in this
Absolutely.
moment of
Yeah, yeah.
not knowing what was going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. That's so cool. Because I know I'd been only talking to land-based agriculture, and there were farms that were, lost 20 million, just huge numbers because they couldn't start restaurants. Because we were the most locked down city in the world, I think, in Victoria. So it was a huge, huge thing that happened. I'm amazed anybody survived it, frankly. So, I mean, financially is what I'm saying. So I take my hat off to you for coming up with the new business model and moving through it. So at that point, if you're shipping fish from Mexico up to what I imagine was Los Angeles or San Diego, where there's the wealthy market there, I'm just curious, you're living in Hawaii now, so there's a bit of a story there as to where were you at that point? You weren't living in Hawaii, surely.
No, I only recently moved to Hawaii. I have a lot of friends, and I spent like my teenage years in Hawaii, and I always wanted to come back here. It's sort of the birthplace of aquaculture in many ways, and it's sort of the heart of the Pacific, and there's just so much happening in the Pacific that needs to be addressed. We're planting seeds for how we can sort of revive aquaculture in Hawaii and be a part of marine protected areas that are being established and need support in Hawaii and throughout the Pacific.
But it's a long transport between Hawaii for fresh fish to the mainland, surely. That's a 5-hour flight.
Yeah, there is a farm on the Big Island that is raising kampachi. There's a handful of farms throughout the islands that are doing various shellfish and sea cucumbers and sea urchins, microalgae. So there's a lot of things happening here. I would say that Hawaii, more so than anywhere else in the United States, has a proactive industry trying to support aquaculture. So it's a good place for us to be.
Yeah,
Not
great.
necessarily from the place of like where commercial operations are happening, but more where a lot of the R&D is happening.
So do you have to fly back to the mainland a lot to see things, or do you just Zoom?
I do a lot of Zoom, yeah. I mean, my business partners are both in Southern California. At this point in our business development, we used to have our own warehouse. Now we do everything through third-party logistics companies. So we're not really in the fulfillment business ourselves. It's outsourced. So our business model today is connecting farms to better quality feed manufacturers, connecting them to the best processors, putting product into shipping containers, and then sending it to our third-party logistics warehouses on East and West Coast. And in the interim, sending it to laboratories and telling that story. And then my business is more like, my day-to-day is more about like, what are we doing on the feed trials and the R&D to evolve the next future state of Seatopia.
And you're still doing direct to consumer. Are you doing it just in America, or are you going global with it, or what's your business model?
It's in America at the moment. Yeah. It's it's a very distributed, the vision is a distributed network of farms around the world that support those local communities. But the reality is at this stage and working with real living systems and living creatures and real communities, it takes time and there's not enough production at this level to support global. But, you know, every
You're
year more is
growing,
coming online.
you've got a pretty big market in America anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you don't really need to go outside your market.
Not for a while. I mean, we get inquiries around the world. It would be wonderful to see, you know, more, Seatopia standard farms in New Zealand and Tasmania and Australia supporting distribution in Australia and more
But you,
microalgae and insect protein.
your website actually did say New Zealand salmon, so you are sourcing from there. So,
Yes.
I mean, that's what is interesting, I think, is like you keep talking about a name of fish I've never heard of. Which did you say, carpaccia? I didn't actually hear the word. The fish that you talk about a lot is something I don't know. Is it a white flesh fish?
Yeah, it's similar to what you guys call kingfish. It's in the same family of Seriola. Seriola lalandi is what you guys call kingfish. This one is Seriola rebelliana. Yeah.
What does
We
it
work
look
with
like?
farms all around the world, like a kingfish, like a yellowtail. Yeah, it looks like that.
A yellowtail. It's a tuna.
No, yellowfin tuna is a tuna, and yellowtail is a Seriola or a jack.
Okay, I don't know what either of those are. It's a thin white fish? I've never heard of a kingfish.
It's a meaty white fish, generally harvested around 5 kilos.
Is it a delicate fish, a hard fish, a soft white flesh fish?
It is a medium, fleshy, whitish pink fish that works great in sashimi and poke. And in sushi bars, there's a species similar to kombachi called hamachi that a lot of people are familiar with. Um,
There you go. I learn something every day. The last time I was in Hawaii many, many years ago, and I had sushi there. It was extraordinary. It was just the most extraordinary sushi I'd ever eaten in a sushi bar in Hawaii and the main island. So I imagine it was pretty fresh at that time. Wouldn't have been frozen locally. Maybe. Who knows?
the other funny thing about seafood is it's not best fresh. That's a big misnomer, is that fresh is best. The reality is fresh seafood, if you catch a fish and eat it right away, it almost has no flavor, just like beef. Aging it imparts a lot of the character, allows the muscle fibers to relax, allows a lot of the amino acids and to to, to evolve, and the flavor profile really is accentuated to the point where fresh fish pales in comparison to a fish that's, let's say 48 hours old, handled properly. The
Two
difference
days.
is, yeah, depending on the species, everyone's different, but
Yeah.
as a rule of thumb for most sport fish, it's not best fresh. The reason why that gets confusing is traditionally a lot of sport fishermen and sort of low quality commercial fishermen would just let fish, they didn't handle it well. And fish in the ocean do not smell fishy. They get fishy when people don't handle them properly, and the long chain omega-3 fatty acids start to oxidize.
I suppose the only thing I'd got with all that would be just catching fish on a boat, sitting in the esky or on ice or something as you bring it home. So it doesn't particularly smell for about a day. You've got about 1 to 2 days in the fridge.
And
That's
it would
fresh
probably
fish.
not smell even longer if when you caught it, you handled it, did an EKG process where you remove the the spinal cord, you remove the bloodline, you remove drain the blood out of it, and you hang it in a manner where all the blood comes out of it and it pulls some of the water out of it. And if you treat it in a cold, dry environment, that fish could dry age until it completely dries and turns to prosciutto like the Vikings did.
Wow.
Dry aging fish is very much is just like dry aged beef is very much about enhancing the characteristics of the fish and preserving it longer. The same thing applies to fish. Fish that are kept wet, like just on ice, are going to eventually create a petri dish environment. Fish that are kept dry and cold are going to simply dry out.
There you go. See, I knew nothing about all that stuff. That's great. That's so interesting. So is the Japanese culture the one that's got a lot of dry-aged fish in their diet? Is that part of their tradition?
It's all around the world. I mean, it is in Japan, but also in Hawaii, also in the Netherlands, and with the Vikings and different places around the world, dry aging. And I mentioned the Vikings because they had the advantage of having cold, windy environment where they could put it, hang their cod
Outside.
outside and have the wind and the cold wind and air dry it and preserve it that way. But drying it in the sun has a similar effect. They often, in warmer climates, they often had to cut it thinner and put salt on it, whereas in in the higher altitudes, they didn't have to do that.
Because that's what you were talking about with the draining of the blood like that. That's a kosher method as well. The kosher methodology in animals is to cut the throat and drain the animal.
Yeah,
straight away. You take the blood out.
and I'm sure it goes all the way back to just how do you make it safer for your
it'd be survival, for preservation without refrigeration.
Yeah,
absolutely.
There's a wonderful chef from South Australia named Josh Nyland who has sort of brought back a lot of the practices and formalized them for a lot of chefs of dry aging, and he's been a real leader in this sort of resurgence of dry aging and whole fish butchery. And if you're not familiar with Josh Nyland, he's in the.
I know the name, I just hadn't looked it up. I suppose fish isn't the kind of a big focus for me because I've been doing a lot more in the red meat area with graziers because that's kind of the main thing that we do here. But certainly the fishing area is big. It's big. We've got, apparently, I learned just yesterday, we've got the largest national ocean land because we have such a big continental shelf in the world. And yet we're a tiny percentage of the global production. I think because of the market, I don't know what, we don't have enough people making it, or I don't know what it is. But apparently they own the land rights to fish in certain areas. In the wild caught area, they are very focused on ecosystem preservation for longevity of fish supply. So I
hope so.
Well, that was the big thing that he was focusing on, so it was like, from his viewpoint, he said the farm fish universe, like what you're in, and the wild fish are like two purists that are almost diametrically opposed in many ways. But I see a lot of parallels in just listening to the two discussions today, yours and his 2 days ago, that are obviously focused on sustainability, longevity of the fish and the environment, and not having the pollutants, and being, like if they have let's call it a land right out in the ocean, they want to make sure it's kept as clean as possible for as long as possible so they have a continuous supply of healthy food. So in a way, you're both motivated by the same thing, which is financial sustainability. And that's a good thing because it'll motivate the quality. I mean, all the problems that we're having are because the money was in doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, short-sightedness.
Yeah. Well, and also some people rubbing their heads together because they lock people into environmental problems. So yeah, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah. I'm not against wild-caught fisheries. I just think that there's already so much demand for wild-caught fish. What we don't have at the moment is enough education and nuanced support for the types of farm-raised fish that are needed to create a truly scalable relationship.
I just had no idea it was as much farm fish as it was, that it was 50% of global protein was now farmed fish, not wild caught. That was excluding wild caught. So that's a huge growth.
Since 2002, it
huge.
actually has surpassed. The amount of wild caught fish actually plateaued and has been decreasing since I think 2002. There's simply not. The demand continues to grow for seafood because there's a growing middle class, there's a growing awareness of the improved sort of health benefits of seafood, yet you have this finite supply.
And I don't think we discussed, how do you keep the microplastics and pollutants out of the water? I mean, sorry?
That's a very important question. Yeah, I'm happy to address it.
We started on it and then we diverged. And I was like, I don't think we've covered that question. I really want to know because I keep thinking about all the stuff I've looked at, and you're in a pen in the ocean water. What are you going to do about the water coming from miles away, coming out your pen?
Yeah. The cool thing is that because we're lab testing, we can quantify, and this is not a hypothetical. The biggest contributor to microplastics in the fish is what they're eating, not the environment that they're swimming in. And I can give you concrete examples. We have fish that are raised in land-based recirculating aquaculture that are basically plastic or PVC pools, and the piping and the tubing and everything is PVC, and there are microplastics in those water. But when we change the feed to be a specific controlled feed, and you feed that to them for a year and a half or however long it takes for that fish to get to maturity, you can create a fish that doesn't have microplastics in them, because
without changing everything
microplastics are
else.
getting in the fish and into the flesh through the feed and through bioaccumulation, not just swimming through it.
That's interesting. And so is that the, let's say it's corn or something like that, is that in the agricultural plastics and things that it's transported in, and how are the plastics getting into the food?
Plastics are getting into the food web, again, through bioaccumulation. So oftentimes what's happening is plastics are breaking down into very small particulates that are being eaten by phytoplankton, zooplankton, and they're being confused for something that you would want to eat. And then a large organism, whether it's a sardine, an anchoveta, whatever, is eating those plankton, and then they're continuing to eat those plankton that have microplastics in them every day throughout their life. And then a mackerel eats those sardines every day throughout their life. And then a kingfish eats it throughout its life. And the further up the food chain you go, just like with the mercury, because they've been eating that every single day, you get depth biomagnification. So the larger fish have higher levels than the small fish.
That's why we've got a teaspoon of plastic in our brains now. A physical teaspoon, not a teaspoon of, a whole physical teaspoon worth of plastic in our brains.
Yeah.
Because of how long we live.
Yeah, it's a sad state that if we allowed fish to simply eat what's in nature, 50% of them are going to have detectable levels of microplastics when you harvest them or test them.
Huge.
In order to make it consistently free of detectable microplastics, we can't allow them to just graze in the ocean anymore. And that is a very strange point in our evolutionary history.
So let me just clarify that. If I see an image of fish swimming through rubbish-infested water with physical bits of plastic, quite apart from all the little bits, as long as it's not, and as long as they're not eating it, the drinking or passing through them is not going to be the bit that's the major part of their getting it in their body.
That's not the major bioaccumulation. It's the consumption.
Eating it.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So many years ago, I met a guy doing a movie called Plasticized. Have you seen it? And Ludlam, his name was. Anyway, he went right out with a whole big bunch of scientists, and they took ocean samples everywhere and on islands that were miles from anywhere. And the bird life was full of physical big pieces of plastic. That was at a physical level. But the microplastic stuff was everywhere throughout the ocean. So I would have thought that they were ingesting it, whether they wanted to or not, just because they drink it or they breathe it. It's passing through them anyway. But you're saying unless it actually gets into their gut and into their bloodstream as food, it's not going to be as detectable, as problematic.
I'm not saying that they're not being exposed to it. I'm not saying that they're not getting it, but when you look at our test results, the biggest thing is what are you feeding them?
Amazing.
Because simply putting them in an environment in proximity to microplastics is not having as profound of an impact as what are they eating for the entire duration of their life.
So in that Aura King video that I was talking about at the beginning, where they just showed the pellets and there's no way of knowing what was in them, you don't really need to know what was in them until you test the product you're about to sell. And then you just say, look, there's this and this and this in it. Go and look at your product.
Yeah, to an extent. The lab test will tell us if there's corn or canola oil. It'll tell us, like because of the omega-3, the omega-6s, you can see a lot of that stuff. You can see if there's antibiotics. We can hold accountability by lab testing. Unfortunately, this sounds crazy, but there's oftentimes the farm doesn't even know exactly what's in the feed because they're not manufacturing the feed. They're buying it from a feed mill. And that feed mill, sometimes anchovetas are like last year, anchoveta fishery, the largest fishery in the world, was closed for the entire season because the biomass indicated that there wasn't enough. So all of a sudden the feed mills had to source something else to get their fish meal and their fish oil. So they're changing it. And the same sort of things happen with global commodities, whether that's corn or soy or flax or
Mm,
whatever it
mm,
is. You know,
mm,
if there's
mm,
like a war in Ukraine, all of a sudden things change for like what's available. So those things are changing as well.
mm.
Yeah, but we can see a lot just by looking as far as like the types of fats and the types of proteins and the presence of toxins in lab tests. And that can oftentimes hold accountability and drive change in how fish are farmed.
That makes sense. So do they then have the pool? If you, for instance, let's just take the Aura King people for the hell of it. So let's say you don't ask them what's in their food because they maybe don't even know. And so you say, well, we're testing your fish and you're getting X, Y, Z. They can then take those test results and say to their fish food supplier, hey, we've got this, 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 and know it's from that because that's what they're feeding them. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah. So what?
when I first did start this study in 1990, and I was going to all these organic conferences, they were talking about fish in particular. I got fascinated in fish, and I found there was only really at that time, I'm sure it's different now, one fish food supplier on the planet, and salmon had textile dyes in it to make the fish red all year round, and which were carcinogenic. I don't know what it is now, but I mean, it was like, wow, this is really bad. So I really avoided salmon, which I love, because of what I kept finding was in the fish food. That's why I keep
Yeah.
asking what's in it.
No, that's a great question. The color of salmon has everything to do with what it's being fed. In the wild, there's in Alaska, there's something called an ivory salmon. It's a salmon that when you catch it looks like any other salmon, but when you open it up, it's pink or white. An ivory salmon is a salmon that mostly ate mackerel as opposed to other salmon that mostly ate krill or crabs or something that's red. And why is what it's eating red? What it's eating is red because further down the food chain, it ate a red algae that produces astaxanthin. And astaxanthin is a carotenoid that is also one of the highest sources of antioxidants on the planet. And
I'm
that
so
red
glad you said that because I was never going to be able to say the word.
astaxanthin, yeah. And astaxanthin is really incredible. There's a farm here in Hawaii that grows a species of algae that produces astaxanthin for salmon farms and nutraceuticals and people who want that antioxidant. I take it as a supplement because not only is it an antioxidant, it also really helps in the sun. So it's something you mentioned earlier, beauty. Like it actually is really healthy to take an antioxidant, the astaxanthin supplements. That said, some salmon farms are just providing astaxanthin in the very finishing stages, or they're opting for a different carotenoid, like an extract from yeast or something else, that doesn't necessarily have the same levels of antioxidants, but still makes it red and is cheaper. So in order for a farm, for a fish to have the right sort of immune response, you really want them to have the natural astaxanthin from that algae in order to have a robust immune system, to be healthier and to actually have, and you want to feed it to them throughout their whole life cycle. So what we're trying to do is quantify antioxidant levels in lab tests, and that's something that we haven't been able to figure out quite yet on a commercially cost-effective level yet. But that's another one of those wonderful signals that will help farms justify, hey, I don't want to just do this as a finishing diet. I don't want to do a cheaper carotenoid or like a carcinogenic red dye number 4 or whatever it is. Species appropriate microalgae that impart the color, that also impart the natural functional benefits. That's the way it should be. And it shouldn't have to be just about like, it's more sustainable or healthier for the animal. It should be, we need to develop market-based tools that incentivize healthier practices. And that's what we're trying to do with this lab test.
So let me ask you this because I'm really curious about this because you are so nerdy about all this and you're testing everything and you take supplements. Have you looked at what the relative amount of, let's say, nutrient in the food that because I'm all about foods rather than supplements. And because you're taking both, I'm curious to see how much, like I was told many years ago that a piece of fish with all of the right things going on was something like 70 times more bionutrient available than any substance that you could take. And I would have thought if you're spending huge quantities of money on supplements, which they are on a daily basis, and you can eat a piece of your fish that's got all of those things in it and it's 70x, that isn't in itself, isn't that a financial viability thing? Your
I'm so
thing
glad you
of
brought that up.
supplements, your thing
Yeah.
of supplements is $100 and piece of fish is 50, but you're getting 70x what you get out of this. And I'm just saying, isn't that something you could be presenting it?
It's such a funny place in America where you have to be really careful with what you say as far as like health benefits. But
Right. Okay.
being able to simply say that each piece of fish has specifically X number of X milligrams of bioavailable omega-3s, EPA, and DHA per serving is allowing a customer to change the conversation from price per pound to price per milligram of bioavailability. And the argument that you bring up about fish being healthier than supplements is so real. And even on the omega-3s, if you research this, um, uh, pro-reactive mediators is this interesting indicator of how our bodies utilize omega-3s much more efficiently when they're delivered in whole fish form as opposed to a shelf-stable tablet. Also, most shelf-stable omega-3s are something called an ethyl ester form, and what your body really wants is the natural form. Your body actually has to convert it from into something that your body can use. And there's a reason why when you take fish oil supplements that are the shelf-stable capsule, you know, legacies are highly like fragile. Like they oxidize really easy. In order to make them shelf stable is wild. And when you eat them, you kind of feel like burpy and like that your body doesn't really digest it very
I
well.
don't
It
like
doesn't
them at
happen
all.
when you that doesn't happen when you eat a beautiful sushi. Like you
No.
don't feel burpy. Your body just absorbs it, right? These proactive mediators and all the other nutrients and micronutrients, macronutrients, and amino acids work better because that's how we simply evolved. You know, we're
I,
giving our
I, I
body the,
completely agree with you, but if you're a punter out there and you don't have access to all of the testing that you do, you're standing there deciding, what am I going to do? You've got all these people telling you need omega-3, you need DHA, blah, 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 and then I've got a piece of fish in me, I have no idea where it came from or what situation it's in, whether it's deadly for me or fresh or good, or which do you do? And I have to say that is really where I've sat in the whole space, because I don't like taking supplements. I'll take things because I have to, because I'm told for some medical reason, but I'd rather be using food as my pharmacy. But sourcing that, even organic doesn't mean it's healthy, because the soil may not be. It's all in the practice. So that's why I'm so thrilled you're doing testing, because nobody does testing because of the cost in it. It's just not viable because people don't pay the money for it, the other side of it. That's why I'm really curious, this journey you're making.
yeah, me too. Me too. If we're successful, we have the ability to scale regenerative seafood. And, just like you were saying, the land-based foods are only as healthy as the soil. The ocean-based foods are only as healthy as the oceans. And we have been using the ocean as a dumping ground for far too long, and it's all interconnected. And
Exactly.
there's not a place in the ocean where microplastics and mercury haven't permeated.
So that's why I was saying about how do you stop the water around it not being poisonous or polluted to the fish itself. And you're saying
It's not just the fish, it's the whole
the food.
ecosystem. It's what are those microalgae, what are those phytoplankton and zooplankton and all the living organisms that are all, unfortunately, it's moved into the food system, into the food web, and that's going to take a while. If we were operating on planetary timelines and we weren't worried about our own or our children, it would solve itself, I do believe. We are making inroads into how do you raise fish on industrial microalgae grown oils and fats and industrial raised insect proteins and other alternative proteins that can be grown in a predictable way in order to simply make fish that don't have toxins that have bioaccumulated from our pollution. So we just have history.
So tell me, how can I help you? What are the things that you're needing to handle these wicked problems that you're intent on solving, which I think is very commendable? What are you looking for? What do you need if you have the money to do it, or what is the thing you're needing to get to the market to understand more? What's the area you got that's the biggest bottleneck for you?
We're balancing this. How do we get farms to adopt better practices? How do we get those novel ingredients, economies of scale that are price parity? And how do we get consumers to ask better questions about where they're getting their seafood? So unfortunately, there's not just one thing that we can work on. We kind of have to move on both ends of the spectrum. It's a whole supply chain
Well, you
challenge.
just have to keep doing these podcasts, absolutely, and I'll do whatever I can to get them out into different realms for you about raising that awareness. Because having said that, I raise the awareness and the person goes, yeah, but where do I buy it? And that's why I asked you myself, where do I buy it? Because you're not in Australia.
Yeah.
So at this point, you would be saying, well, we can recommend you.
I can recommend some farms like those. If you're asking about New Zealand king salmon, Akora is a good example.
Maybe you
Send
can
me
give
an
me a
email.
list of them, and
Yeah,
I'll put them
and we
on
can put it in the show notes.
We can
Yep.
put them in the show notes, because I mean, it's all very well. Let's say you say it's king or whatever, Akora, and then I go, okay, well, I'm not buying a ton of fish. I'm buying a piece of fish. But the next step for that for me is, well, who do you supply into in Australia? And I, for instance, buy from the best quality fish shops in Australia. And so I personally can walk into them and say, do you use this supplier?
Exactly.
And then I can go, okay, can I buy your fish? So that's kind of like where it's at. And I can certainly tell more people if I know that's what the best one is.
And when you're in that market, okay, I'm concerned about mercury. I'm concerned about microplastics. I want to know what nutrient these fish were fed and what is the nutritional quality of this fish. And if it was farmed, I want to know, was it fed corn and soy, or was it fed microalgae or insect protein? It's not that complicated. When you buy beef or chicken, you're asking the same questions. You're asking, what did it eat? How was it farmed? By who? Where? How was it harvested? When?
It's kind of easier in that area because, well, certainly here we have a lot of land, so it's cheaper to be doing grass, and so people mainly do grass. It's not terribly complex. But in these more industrialized things, like what we're talking about, where there's so many different variables in it, like you walk up to the shop and the guy at the shop has no idea. So at one point I said, well, could I get some wild caught salmon? And I waited 3 months for some stuff to come in from Canada, Alaska. And it was this red, bright red. I couldn't believe the cut, never seen it. And I couldn't eat it. It was it was so smelly. It was so strong. It was like eating game. And I've never eaten it like that. I like the fatty salmon that I've been raised on. And I'm the same with chickens. A wild chicken or a chicken that's been walking around is scrawny and tough and not pleasant, or it's, they've been puffed up. They're actually full of inflammation because they've been fed on corn and stuff that's not good for them. All the rest of it. So it's difficult it's easier to eat plants, frankly.
Well, it's the balance, right? It's somewhere in the middle, right? Like the chicken and the fish. It's not about that wild caught piece of salmon that you had that was dark red. Probably it didn't have very much fat in it either, and may not have been handled properly, and that's why it was fishy. What you want with a piece of salmon that you're familiar with, that you're describing, actually has more fat content in it than that piece of salmon because it was raised in a specific environment. Just what types of fats? How do we get all the things that we've been talking about mean nothing if we can't make it delicious, because everybody speaks delicious, right? So it needs to be nutritious and delicious, and it absolutely can be done. And that's the gold standard. If we get people to vote with their forks because it's delicious and nutritious, then that'll work.
Well, look, and going back to that salmon that I was talking about, the reason I was following it through, then they kept saying it was organic, was because it was the most delicious salmon I'd ever eaten. And I went out of my way to go to the store when they would get it in, their organic salmon, which I found was a lie, and which I think even they didn't know was a lie. And they were selling it for quite a lot more, but I would have paid that I was paying that because it was so fabulous. It was melt in your mouth. And I was told it's probably just because it's a different species. So it was so amazing.
Atlantic versus king salmon is a different species. Even within king salmon, yeah, there's quite a few different species of Pacific salmon, for example. The silver salmons, the chum salmons, the pink salmons. What you probably had was a pink salmon. Uh, It's uh, it's very
It
important
was fabulous.
that it's delicious. That's very important for people to buy it again.
As
For
a
those farms,
restaurateur, as a person from restaurants all my life, delicious is the thing. I did lots of studies on. We did 50,000 customers a week, and I did lots of studies on them over the years. And now they'll put up with a lot of stuff. They'll put up with dirt. They'll put up with bad service. They'll put up, but if it's not delicious when it hits the table, they don't come
yeah,
back.
they're not coming
So
back. Yeah, yeah,
that is the
yeah.
critical thing. I agree. You go a long way out of your. I always refer to the Seinfeld soup Nazi episodes. Carrying around
Yes,
this kind of says
yeah,
everything. You put up with
yeah,
everything if it's really good. It's so
exactly.
good.
Yeah, yeah.
No soup for
Well,
you.
well, if you make it to the United States, we'll get you a Seatopia box. Happy to send that to you. In the interim, I will send you the names of a handful of farms that we do endorse. You can put those in the show notes. And
Lovely. Wonderful.
yeah, yeah, it's worth noting that everything that we recommend is delicious as well.
I will say that I also have, I'm actually working in between the UAE and here, and I have a license to bring food into the UAE. So, and I have been slowly opening my lines into their sustainable and highly noted restaurateurs that are in there because they pretty much import everything.
Yeah,
Maybe we'll do some
something to
work
explore.
over there as well.
Okay. Yeah,
Lovely to talk to
wonderful.
you and wonderful to come on the
Likewise.
show. I will
Thank you
send
so
you stuff
much.
later.
Thank you
Okay.
for having this conversation. It's important. And your business name Earth, you've spent so much time talking about soil, and it's very, very important, but it should not be overlooked that this is the blue planet, and the levers of change for climate change and ecosystem restoration through ocean systems is completely untapped. And by far the most powerful lever that we have is analyzing ecosystem services of the ocean to
Well, my
change
business
climate.
partner is he's all about the ocean. The company's called Ocean Merge and Ocean Blocks, and we're very focused on the oceans. We're very aware of it. So it is 3/4 of the planet. It's every second of breath we take and all those things. So it's not we don't. I've been trying to stick in my lane with the soil. So it's wonderful to talk to you. And
Likewise, thank you. Thank you,
okay,
Samantha.
bye, honey. Have a great day.
Bye. Have a good one.
Bye.